Hello everyone, Keegan Keen here, and today I'm going to be going over creating a drop-down list function so you can switch between different patterns. This video is going to be a bit of a follow-up to my chainmail breakdown video I did right before this. I'll have a link of that in the description. But what I'm going to be going over today is how you can create a parameter like this, chainmail type, that allows you to easily switch between different height patterns. Let me click on this last one here so you can see the changes there. If I go to pattern, I can switch between 6 and a 1 chainmail, I can go to circular loop chainmail, and I can switch between all these. And you can create lists very large and use this for a lot of different functions like switch between colors and so forth. So before I go into how this little setup works, it's a very simple setup. I'm going to add in a blend node to show you how to start getting into functions and also show you what you need to do in order to drive a function. So functions in Substance Designer will take information from an exposed parameter. In the event of these nodes up here, they are all getting integers from my pattern chainmail type here. And so if you set this to type integer 1 and then set to a drop-down list, you'll get a drop-down list just like this. It has like 9 by default, but you can add and remove things by hitting the X here to delete items or add. Since it starts with 9, I deleted a few to get down to the total of 5 here. And then I renamed each of these to what I wanted them to be. I know I'm going to be switching between these 5 different patterns, so I did a total of 5 here and renamed them as such. And also what's important to note is the number here, because this is the information the functions inside these blend nodes is going to be gathering. So I'll be showing you how to get that data inside there. But first, so if I go to a blend node and I want to drive it with a function, I can, the reason I put the switch there is we're going to be switching between foreground and background, and the blending mode switch will function faster than copy if you do so. But anyway, the first thing I'll do is I'll go to the opacity slider, and I know that if I duplicate this real quick and make it a different color, so I know that at an opacity of 1 it's going to use foreground, but at an opacity of 0 it's going to use background. It's important to remember that bit of information there. And so if you click right here, this little button at the far right, you can put in a parameter, but you can also choose empty function. So now we have an empty function, or to get inside that, I click it again. And now I'm inside my empty function, and I can gather information, start putting in lots of different nodes for functions. So I'm going to go back and delete that. And I'm going to gather these nodes and move them up real quick, and I'm going to build them again from scratch to show you. But basically what's happening here is each of these nodes on the inside, so if I click it here, I can go into the function on that blend node right here. And as you can see, it's very little here, you don't have to do a lot. But what's happening inside these nodes is it's looking at that parameter, which I called chainmail type. And as you saw, I had the numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 on the drop-down list. So those are the numbers it's looking at right now. So I know this is going to give me the number either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And this first node here is called a comparison equal. It basically looks at input A and sees if it's equal to input B. If so, it will output true. If not, it will output false. And this is an if-else node. It will basically look at any if-else statement and say if it's true, the if here, it'll give this number. If it's false, it'll give this number. And then this is the final output number. So I'm actually going to build this from scratch to show you kind of the workflow for doing that. So I'm going to delete these nodes and these nodes, and I'm going to move these aside for now. Alright, so I've got my 5 patterns here. This is pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, and I put this as 5. So I'm going to add a blend node and click it, and I'll click blend node again to plug that in, and again and again. So I have a total of 4. Now, the reason I have 4 and not 5 is that this first one I can use the blend between pattern 1 and 2. Then this will have pattern 3, pattern 4, and pattern 5. It does become a little bit easier to understand if I had a 5th node here, but it's just more efficient to use less nodes. So I'm going to go ahead and plug these in. So this is pattern 1. Plug that into there. Pattern 2. Pattern 3. Pattern 4. And down here, pattern 5. Alright, next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to offset these some so I can see the noodles a little bit better. So I'm going to click here and change these to switch. And while I'm at it, I'm going to click right here and hit empty function. And I'm going to do that on the other 4 also. So switch, empty function. Overall, it would probably be quicker if I already did this on just one of the blend nodes and then I duplicated them. That way it would duplicate what I had changed here. That's something to keep in mind. And empty function. Alright, so all these have an empty function now, and I'm going to go and plug this end piece into pattern on the end here. So right now, what we basically want to happen is, as I said, when opacity is at 0, it lets things pass through. So you can imagine if I want this pattern to go through, this needs to be at 1 here, basically saying to use the foreground and not the background. But then everything in front needs to be set to 0, saying let background pass straight through, don't replace it with foreground. So in that sense, I can write a function that says if I have 1, or for this node here, it should be option 2, that if it's true, I want this set to 1, but I want everything else set to 0. So I'm going to start with this back node here, and to remember what numbers I'm using, I can double click here and go to that parameter I added, just to be sure, so I want to know what, say, 8 and 1 is. I know 8 and 1, yes, that is number 2. And this would be 0, and this would be 1. So I'm going to go here, the function button, I'm going to hit space, I'm going to type get, because I'm going to be getting some information. And there's a lot of different gets here, and it's important that you know what you're getting. Because that drop-down list we made, I set it to an integer 1, as you remember. That is why I need to get integer. If I did a get float, it's not going to appear. And also, my identifier is called chainmail type, because you are also going to need to specify what you want to know what you're getting. So I have a different bunch here, but I know I want chainmail type, so I'm going to click that. So now I'm getting those numbers, which is either 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4 at the moment. And the first thing I want to do is check to see if it's getting a specific number. So I'm going to do get, or I'm going to check. So I want to use a equal. I basically want to see if this is equal to 1 on this node. So if this is the number 1, which is actually our second option, it will use European 6 and 1. If it's not 1, it's going to use 0, which will use this pattern. So I'm going to come in here and plug that in, and then I'm going to type integer to get another integer. And if you haven't looked at functions too much right now, I do suggest looking at some other function modes from Algorithmic before watching this one. But these colors here are very important. you cannot mix match these colors. They basically define the difference between floats, float twos, integers, and you can't mix match them always. For these we can, they remain gray. But in a moment here I'll spawn a node that won't allow it. And an integer, in case you aren't too sure what that is a whole number, as in 1, 2, 3, or 4. A float, though, can have decimal places, so we can have a 0.5 if it was a float. So I'm going to check this if it's a 1. If it is, it will enable true, else it will do false. So I'm going to spawn an if else now. As you can see, it's looking for a condition, which this is a condition node. So as you can see, the colors match up. I can't plug in an integer here, for example, it won't allow. And for this one, those change colors now, saying it wants an integer. But something to keep in mind here is this node is going to become our output node. The output node is the number that will drive the opacity slider here. So we know the opacity slider here goes from 0 to 1, and it has decimal places. So this is actually a float, not an integer. If my output node here was yellow, basically saying it's an integer, and I tried to set this as an output, it won't allow me because I'm trying to set an integer as an output for a float variable. So the two numbers here I need to compare or need to be floats. So I'm going to spawn this float, hit Control D to duplicate. So if it is 1, so if my drop-down parameter is at 1, which one option is the European 6 and 1, I want the opacity to be at 1. So if it's at 1, set the opacity to 1. If it's not 1, I want it to be 0. And as you know, 0 puts the opacity all the way down, letting the other pattern travel straight through. So now we've got our function set up for that first node. And to output it, you need to go to the last node here, right click, and say set as output node. And we notice something just changed here. That was the active node we were using. But if I go to my parameter now, chainmail type, and this is checking for a 1, right now it's at a 0 because it's not a 1 currently. This little checkbox says it's at 2, which that's okay later on, and I'll show you why. But if I hit 1, we notice it changed. Selected, I went to 1. It says, oh, it's 1. I'm going to choose the foreground now. So we know it's working. If I go to 0, which I told if it's not 1, do a 0, it goes back to 0. Very nice. And of course, going to 2 and 3 also puts it at 0. Like I said, I'll explain why that's okay. So I'm going to actually go back into this node here, and I'm going to select all this and hit Control C. Because we're going to use the exact same setup for the others, we're just changing one number. So this is saying I want to use European chain 6 and 1 chainmail if it is at the number 1. Because this is option number 1, and this is option 0. So for option 2, I want the check if it's getting 2. So I go into here, I go into the function graph, I'm going to paste what we just copied. As you can see, it's checking for if it's 1. I'm going to tell it to check for 2 now. And that's all good now. I click at the end, right click, says output node. Now I'm going to go back, and we can test this for just doing options 1 and 2. So if I go down to pattern chainmail type, I can hit 0, and as I can see, it's choosing option 0. If I hit pattern number 1, I can see that it is getting pattern number 1. Then if I hit 2, I can see now it's getting pattern 2. So this is the end of the line so far. These nodes aren't currently working with it, but they'll be working very soon. So of course I click here again, go into function, paste, and this time I'm checking for 3, because this is my third option. Technically it's my fourth since we have option 0. But we change that, click here, set as output node. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do that on the last one. Go into the function, paste, set this one to 4, which is our 5th option. Click, says output node. So now we should all be set up for this. So if I go back to my pattern here, HTML type, if I'm on option 0, I'm going to double click this end piece real quick to make sure that's what's displaying down here. Right, so if I go to option HTML type, if I hit 0, I'm getting pattern 0. 2, I'm getting just pattern 2. 3, getting 3, that's good. And this should be the circular. Sweet. Yes, this all works. So the reason for all of these that, like I was saying, it doesn't matter that if the other numbers are at 3 or 4, because we notice that inside this function here, I was just checking to see if it's 1, if it's not, let it pass through. If any of these are at 3, or say option 3 here's at 3, and it's using the foreground, it doesn't care what's happening behind it. I could do whatever, but the foreground's going to overwrite what's ever happening behind it. So you don't always have to worry about what's happening behind it when you change something in the future down a chain of blend nodes. So usually the easiest way is to only say if it is, put the opacity at 1, if not, put it at 0. And if things are changing between 1 and 0, it's changing something ahead, it won't matter as long as it's going to 1 and overriding it. So I hope that explains a bit better of how I did my function setup for the substance. And like I said before, this chainmail substance along with the other 9 should be coming to game textures soon. So keep an eye out for that, and thanks for watching.